As I approached their table, everything else around me seemed to dissolve into silence. Her laughter died mid-sentence the moment our eyes met. Wide with shock, her face drained of all color. I calmly slid the divorce papers onto the table, tucking them between her wine glass and dinner plate. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady yet ice-cold. Her lover froze, his self-assured demeanor crumbling as recognition dawned on him. The betrayal hung thick in the air, suffocating in its weight. I watched her trembling fingers as she opened the envelope. Her expression shifted, first confusion, then pure, undeniable despair. This was it, the moment when everything began to unravel. But before I dive further into the story, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment below. And if you're a fan of stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The restaurant was the epitome of understated elegance. Soft, golden light glowed off polished wine glasses and spotless white tablecloths, while the gentle hum of quiet conversations intertwined with the soothing notes of background music. Laughter, light and carefree, punctuated the room, a melody that only deepened the ache in my chest. For me, though, it wasn't just music. It was a cruel symphony playing over my heartbreak. I stood at the entrance, my suit crisp and unwrinkled, my face impassive as stone. Yet, in my hand, the envelope trembled, a betrayer of my turmoil. The divorce papers inside were a silent testament to the storm within me. My eyes, darkened by emotions I refused to shed, focused on the far corner of the room. There she was, sitting with her back to me, laughter pouring from her like a blade sinking into my chest. Emily's hand lingered on Daniel's arm, an intimate gesture too familiar for comfort. She leaned in closer, her blue dress shimmering softly under the low lights, a cruel echo of a memory that once felt sacred. Daniel, unaware and entirely self-assured, smiled warmly as his fingers brushed hers. They acted as though the world existed solely for them. The air around me felt dense and suffocating. Each breath was a struggle against the invisible weight pressing down on me. I took a step forward, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. The moment was thick with tension, ready to break everything in its path. Our marriage had started out like a masterpiece, a canvas painted in vibrant strokes of shared dreams and passionate moments. Evenings were filled with laughter, our hands always intertwined beneath the soft glow of candlelight. But as time wore on, the colors dulled. Routine crept in like an unwelcome guest, turning our deep conversations into rehearsed pleasantries. Dinners that once felt like celebrations grew quieter, the clink of silverware filling the spaces where our words had once thrived. Our bed, once a sanctuary of whispered secrets and tender touches, grew colder, an expanse of emptiness neither of us dared to cross. I tried to reignite that lost spark, a bouquet of her favorite flowers, a surprise weekend getaway, but all I received in return were polite, distant smiles. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now looked somewhere far away, as if longing for something I could no longer provide. Meanwhile, Emily drifted further, chasing after something that felt just out of reach, a spark that routine had snuffed out. She avoided my gaze, and her affections dwindled into fleeting gestures that felt like echoes of a past life. The small signs spoke louder than any words could. The way she turned away when I leaned in to kiss her, the hesitation before her reluctant embrace. Every little moment was another thread snapping loose until the fabric of our life together became a fragile frame of what it once was. In that silence, fragile but deafening, I began to see the truth we had never spoken aloud. At first, the cracks had been so small, At first, the changes were barely noticeable, so subtle they were easy to dismiss. Emily's occasional late nights always came with a reasonable explanation. An art exhibit here, a meeting with students there. At least, that's what she told me. And I, ever the trusting husband, brushed off the unease that tugged at the corners of my thoughts. But that unease didn't go away. Instead, it grew, a persistent knot tightening in my chest. One evening, she came home hours later than expected. Her face was flushed, her smile forced, and her excuse sounded too rehearsed. The gallery owner wanted to discuss a future collaboration, she said, her eyes darting away as she walked past me into the kitchen. I nodded, but her words stuck in my mind. The cadence was off, too measured, too practiced. There was a strain in her voice I couldn't ignore. Then came the phone calls. More than once, I walked into the room to find Emily speaking in hushed tones. Her laughter sounded strange, almost unnatural. The moment she noticed me, the conversation would abruptly end. "Just a student," she'd say with a casual wave of her hand. But her smile never reached her eyes anymore. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that with every whispered conversation, she was slipping further away from me. It was the small things that haunted me. The unfamiliar perfume clinging to her coat, the constant buzzing of notifications on her phone. She carried it everywhere, practically glued to her hand. One night, as we sat together on the couch, I leaned in close, and she flinched ever so slightly, tucking her phone out of sight. "It's nothing," she assured me, but the tension in her voice betrayed her. The late nights became more frequent, and when I asked where she'd been, her explanations became vaguer, her excuses thinner. "Just a last-minute meeting," she'd say. "You know how demanding the school can be." But as she spoke, her eyes darted anywhere but toward mine, her fingers nervously fidgeting with her bag. One rainy evening, she rushed out the door, saying she had to meet a colleague. I stood there in the quiet hallway, watching her silhouette disappear into the downpour. For the first time, anger sparked inside me, mixing with the hurt. I wanted to believe her. I really did, but every instinct told me something was wrong. That night, I sat alone in my dimly lit study, staring into the darkness. And for the first time, I made a decision. I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. If Emily was hiding something, I had to uncover it. No matter how painful the truth might be, I needed to know. The choice to hire a private investigator wasn't an easy one. For weeks, I wrestled with the idea, caught between my desperate need to trust her and the gnawing doubt that refused to let me rest. But after yet another evening of vague excuses and hurried goodbyes, I knew trust alone wasn't enough. I needed answers. When I opened my office door, my resolve was set. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Hannah, was both efficient and discreet. She listened intently as I recounted everything. Emily's late-night meetings, the hushed phone calls, the emotional distance that had settled into our home. "It could be nothing," I muttered, as if trying to convince myself. Hannah nodded, her face unreadable. "But if it's something," she said calmly, "we'll find it." The first couple of days brought nothing new, just the same routine I already knew too well. Emily left the house under the guise of work or errands. But on the third day, Hannah called with a lead. "She's meeting someone," she said, her tone careful. "But not at a gallery or the school, a cafe downtown." Ethan felt his heart sink as Hannah sent over the photos. There was Emily, sitting across from another man. She was leaning toward him, her face lit up by a smile Ethan hadn't seen in years. Her hand rested lightly on his, their posture close, comfortable in a way that spoke volumes. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiated confidence. But his face was unfamiliar. A stranger who had somehow woven his way into Emily's life. Hannah wasn't done. Over the next week, she kept tabs on him, trailing the man Emily had called Daniel and intercepting bits of their communication. His background, it turned out, was murky. His movements raised red flags. "He's not just someone she's seeing," Hannah explained during their next meeting, her eyes sharp. "He's a professional con artist. This isn't the first time he's done this." Ethan's stomach twisted as she laid out the evidence. A string of aliases, fake bank accounts, and connections to past scams. Daniel had a pattern. Targeting women in vulnerable places, charming them, and exploiting their trust to drain them financially. And Emily? She fit the profile perfectly, a woman yearning for change, with just enough financial stability to make her an appealing target. The bank records confirmed everything. Transfers Emily had made to accounts Ethan didn't recognize, large enough to matter, but small enough to fly under the radar. The betrayal hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about infidelity. Emily hadn't only betrayed their vows. She had put their entire family's security in the hands of a man who saw her as nothing more than a payday. The realization was devastating. Every smile she gave, every excuse she made, every lie she told. It wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the life they had built, slowly unraveling beneath the weight of her choices. Yet, underneath the anger that surged through Ethan, there was something deeper, a profound sadness. He mourned for the woman he had once loved, the Emily who had glowed with joy and passion. Now she was someone else entirely, someone desperate enough to believe in Daniel's hollow promises. Ethan knew what he had to do. He would confront them both, but not with reckless rage. He'd planned it down to the last detail. This wasn't just about calling out their betrayal. It was about reclaiming his dignity and ending the charade that had consumed his life. As Ethan stared at the evidence spread out before him, his resolve hardened. The truth, however painful, was now his weapon. The restaurant exuded refinement. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, and the faint notes of a piano filled the room. Ethan stepped inside, his polished shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. His expression was calm, unreadable. To anyone watching, he was just another guest. A man in a suit, perhaps meeting a client or sharing a romantic evening. But the envelope in his hand told a different story. He scanned the room with quiet precision until his gaze landed on them. Emily was radiant in the blue dress he'd given her, the fabric shimmering softly under the warm candlelight. She was leaning toward Daniel, her laughter light, almost melodic. Daniel, as confident as ever, rested his hand on the table, brushing his fingers against hers. The intimacy between them was undeniable. In that small, candlelit space, they seemed completely lost in their own world. Ethan's chest tightened, but his face betrayed nothing. He had rehearsed this moment over and over in his mind. Now it was time to act. As he moved toward their table, the air around him felt thick with tension. The maitre d' greeted him with a polite nod, but Ethan barely acknowledged him. His focus was locked ahead, his steps slow and deliberate, each one reverberating in his ears like a drumbeat. Emily didn't notice him at first. She was mid-sentence, her hand gesturing animatedly as Daniel sat back, smiling, clearly entranced by her. But as Ethan drew closer, her laughter faltered. It was subtle, a slight hesitation in her voice, a flicker of awareness that she was being watched. Her eyes flicked upward, locking onto mine. In an instant, her expression froze. Her face went pale, the playful smile wiped away and replaced by a mix of shock and fear. Daniel, sensing the change, glanced over his shoulder. The confidence he had worn like armor slipped the moment our eyes met. The man who had seemed so self-assured now looked visibly uneasy. His fingers twitched slightly, and he shifted in his seat as though it suddenly felt too small. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm and steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. With deliberate precision, I placed the envelope on the table, sliding it neatly between Emily's wine glass and her plate. The soft scrape of paper against would seem to echo louder than the surrounding murmurs of conversation. Neither of them spoke at first. Emily's eyes stayed fixed on the envelope as though it were a live grenade. Her hands hovered uncertainly above the table, trembling just enough to betray her. Daniel leaned back in his seat, trying to regain his composure, but the tension in his jaw and his darting eyes told a different story. I stood tall, my hands resting calmly at my sides, a picture of restrained power. "I think you should read it," I said evenly, my tone carrying no malice but an undeniable authority. Emily's lips parted as if she was about to say something, but no words came. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, hesitant, as though touching it would make the truth inside come to life and crush her. Daniel cleared his throat, attempting to break the moment. "Look, maybe this isn't the place, My gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. "You don't get to decide that," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. Daniel visibly shrank back, his bravado slipping away like a crumbling mask. Emily finally picked up the envelope, Her hands shook so much that the paper crinkled as she unfolded it. Her eyes skimmed the words, and with every line, her face collapsed further. Tears welled up, but she fought to keep them from falling, glancing up at me with a desperate, pleading look. "Ethan, she began. I raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't," I said softly but firmly. "I know everything, Emily. Every excuse, every lie. I've seen it all. And now it ends here." The room seemed to hold its breath. The other diners carried on, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the color draining from his face as I turned my focus to him. "And you?" I said, my voice colder now. "Do you want to explain yourself? Or should I do it for you?" Daniel stammered, his composure unraveling. I think we should all just calm down." I leaned in slightly, narrowing the space between us, my calm exterior masking the rage simmering beneath. "Calm," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "You conned my wife, stole from my family, and destroyed the life we built. You don't get to ask for calm." Emily's tears spilled over, her composure finally shattering. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Daniel's eyes darted toward the door, as if considering an escape. But I didn't move. I didn't need to. My presence alone pinned him in place. The weight of the moment settled heavily over all of us. I straightened, taking one last look at them. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said, my voice low but resolute. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them behind in the wreckage of their choices. The silence left in my wake felt deafening, a final, crushing punctuation to the moment. The tension clung to the air, thick and suffocating. I spoke again, my voice low but sharp enough to slice through the atmosphere. "Good evening," I said, my gaze locked on Emily. I placed the envelope squarely on the table with deliberate precision. "I think you should read this." Emily froze, a shallow breath catching in her throat. Her hands hovered over the envelope, trembling as if it was too hot to touch. What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted between me and Daniel, desperate for answers she wasn't ready to hear. My expression remained unmoved, a calm, composed facade concealing the storm surging within me. "I'm finishing what you started," I replied evenly, each word deliberate and weighted with finality. "Go on, open it." Her fingers fumbled as she picked up the envelope, her heart pounding so hard I could almost hear it. Slowly, she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. I watched the color drain from her face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. This isn't necessary. We can talk about this." I narrowed my eyes, my tone unrelenting. "Talk?" I asked coldly. "You mean like the way you've been talking to him?" I nodded toward Daniel but never broke eye contact with her. Daniel, who had been sitting in silence, straightened awkwardly in his chair. His smile was forced, too casual to be anything but fake. "Listen," he began, his voice too breezy to match the gravity of the moment. "I don't think this is the time or place for—" "Don't?" I interrupted, my voice quiet but sharp enough to make him falter. "You've had plenty of time to run your little game. It's over now." Daniel shifted in his seat, his confidence crumbling by the second. I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his tone tinged with defensiveness. "This is a misunderstanding." I leaned in just enough for my voice to drop into an icy whisper. "Is it?" I asked, my gaze unyielding. "Should I explain to Emily about your scams? The aliases? The money transfers? Or would you prefer to do that yourself?" Emily's head snapped toward Daniel, her face a mask of confusion and betrayal. "What is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice cracking with disbelief. Daniel's composure shattered completely. "Emily, I can explain." "Enough," I said, straightening up, my gaze bore down on both of them, finality etched into every syllable. "You've both said enough. Now, live with it." I turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence more devastating than my words. As I walked, I felt their stunned silence follow me. Still, I shifted my focus entirely to Daniel for one last parting blow. "Your future with him," I said, glancing at Emily, "is built on lies. Every dollar, every promise. It was all a con." Emily's face crumpled, her lips trembling as though trying to form words that simply wouldn't come. Her hand gripped the edge of the napkin on her lap, her fingers tightening around the fabric in a desperate attempt to ground herself. Her breathing quickened, her eyes darting between Daniel and me as if searching for a lifeline. A shred of clarity in the chaos my words had unleashed. Daniel let out a nervous, hollow laugh. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice wavered at the edges, betraying his unease. "Ethan, you're upset. I get that. But let's not throw around baseless accusations." I raised a brow, my face unreadable, my tone razor-sharp. "Baseless?" I asked, reaching into my jacket pocket. I withdrew a slim folder and tossed it onto the table. The papers fanned out slightly, snapshots of bank transfers, aliases, and the names of Daniel's previous victims. "Is this baseless?" I continued, my voice calm but lethal. "The money she wired to you? The promises you made? Or maybe you'd prefer to explain the other women you've left in ruins. When their accounts ran dry, he left them behind." Emily's hands shook visibly as she reached for the folder. Her tear-filled eyes darted across the pages, her lips silently forming words she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. Her chest rose and fell as the weight of the truth pressed down on her. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This can't be. This isn't true. Daniel, tell him he's lying." Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair, the last remnants of his confidence slipping away like water through a sieve. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The charming facade he relied on was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. His gaze darted toward the exit, as though calculating an escape. Ethan took a step closer, his voice calm but laced with quiet fury. "Go ahead, Daniel," he said softly. "Tell her it's a lie. Convince her you didn't use her. Make her believe that the thousands she gave you weren't part of your plan." Daniel's mouth opened again, but his voice cracked. "Emily," he began, his tone pleading, but Emily cut him off. Her trembling hands slammed the folder shut, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Her shoulders shook under the weight of her devastation. "How could you?" she gasped, her words jagged and uneven. Her hand covered her mouth as though trying to stifle a scream. The napkin she had clutched in her lap slipped from her grip and fell to the floor, crumpled and forgotten. She turned to Daniel, her tear-streaked face filled with disbelief. Was any of it real? Daniel hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find an answer. But the silence that followed was louder than any confession. It was the only answer Emily needed. Ethan watched her fall apart, his expression unreadable, though his eyes softened for just a moment. There was no triumph in seeing her like this, no sense of victory, just the hollow ache of a truth finally exposed. "You betrayed me," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "But worse, you betrayed yourself. You let him manipulate you. You let him turn our life into a tool for his schemes. And now," he exhaled slowly, "now he'll leave you with nothing." Emily's sobs filled the air, raw and unguarded. Her hands trembled as she reached out toward Ethan, a silent plea for something. Understanding, forgiveness, anything. But Ethan stepped back, putting a small but significant distance between them. "I didn't mean," she choked out, but the words slipped away, fragile and formless, like sand through her fingers. Ethan's expression hardened once more. His resolve was unshaken. "Not meaning to doesn't undo what you've done," he said. "This is the end, Emily. For us, for everything we built." He turned to Daniel, his gaze icy. "And you'll face the consequences soon enough." With that, Ethan turned on his heel and walked away. The sound of his footsteps receded, each one a note of finality. At the table, Emily crumbled into herself, tears streaming as the weight of her choices came crashing down. Daniel's once polished confidence was completely shattered. His eyes darted around the restaurant, searching for an escape route, as if the walls themselves were closing in. His posture, once relaxed and assured, was stiff and awkward. His fingers fidgeted nervously at the edge of the table, desperate for something to hold on to. The revelations, paired with Emily's tearful disbelief, had stripped away his charm, leaving only a desperate, cornered man. I think this has gone far enough," Daniel muttered, but his voice was weak. Frayed at the edges, barely more than a whisper. Daniel's voice was barely audible, trembling as he muttered, "I don't need to be part of this." He pushed his chair back abruptly, the harsh screech of its legs against the floor drawing glances from nearby tables. The quiet murmur of conversation faltered as heads turned. Ethan watched with cold, detached amusement, crossing his arms as Daniel struggled to stand. "Running already?" Ethan asked, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the room like a knife. "Isn't this the part where you spin one of your famous stories? Convince her it's all a misunderstanding? Or are you finally out of lies?" Daniel didn't respond. His face flushed as he fumbled with his jacket, his hands unsteady. His gaze flickered briefly toward Emily. She remained motionless, paralyzed by her own grief, her tear-streaked face a silent testament to the destruction he had caused. Finding no solace in her, Daniel turned toward the exit, his movements hurried and clumsy, a far cry from the suave confidence he had displayed before. "Go ahead," Ethan called after him, his voice laced with disdain. "Run, just like you always do." Then he turned toward Emily, his words deliberate and unrelenting. "That's the man you chose over us. A coward who takes what he can and bolts the moment things get hard. He'll leave you with nothing, just like I said." Daniel paused at the door for a split second, as though considering a retort, but no words came. The weight of Ethan's gaze pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Finally, Daniel pushed the door open and disappeared into the night without so much as a backward glance. The restaurant seemed to exhale as he left, the tension easing, though the aftermath still clung thick in the air. Ethan let out a quiet sigh, his eyes settling on Emily one last time. "You see, Emily," he said, his voice softer but no less resolute, "when you gamble everything on a lie, this is all you're left with." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone to face the emptiness Daniel had left behind. As the weight of Daniel's departure settled over her, Emily broke the silence, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "Please." Her hands, still shaking, reached out toward him, a fragile, desperate gesture. "I was wrong," she whispered, the words stumbling out between sobs. "I know I was wrong, but you." Her voice cracked, and fresh tears streamed down her face. "You can't just leave like this. We can fix it. I can fix it." Ethan's gaze shifted toward her. His expression was unyielding, his jaw tight. For a brief moment, he said nothing, letting her words linger in the heavy silence between them. Emily pressed on, her voice splintering under the weight of her guilt. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen. Please, Ethan, don't let it end this way." Her swollen, red-rimmed eyes searched his face, desperate for any sign of softness, any glimmer of hope that he might relent. But his cold, steely gaze didn't waver. "This way?" he repeated, his voice measured and quiet. "Emily, it ended the moment you made your choice." "No," she sobbed, shaking her head as though trying to reject the truth. "It was a mistake. I was lost. I didn't—" Her voice cracked again, and she covered her mouth with trembling hands. "I didn't know what I was doing. I let myself believe something that wasn't real. But I see it now. I see everything now." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of something unspoken crossing his face. But whatever it was, he buried it just as quickly. A flicker of something crossed Ethan's face before he straightened his posture. "You see it now?" he asked, his tone sharp, cutting through her pleas like ice. After the lies, the deceit, and the betrayal, you see it now because you've lost everything? But you didn't see it when I was standing right in front of you, doing everything I could to hold us together. I was wrong, she cried, her voice rising, raw and broken. I was blind, selfish, call it whatever you want. But I'm begging you, Ethan, for the sake of our family, for the sake of what we used to have, please. Ethan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides before he exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, chillingly so. You made your choices, Emily. Now, live with them. The finality of his words hung in the air, leaving no room for argument, no space for hope. He turned and began to walk away, his steps steady and unwavering, leaving Emily crumpled in her seat, consumed by the weight of her loss. But as he reached the edge of the table, Ethan stopped, his back still to her. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, the burden of everything unsaid pressing down on his shoulders. When he finally turned, his expression was no longer cold, but resolute. A man making one final attempt to salvage what still mattered. This isn't just about you and me anymore, he said, his voice quieter but firm. What's broken between us? It can't be fixed, Emily. Not after this. But the kids, they still need a mother. Emily lifted her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. They don't deserve to suffer because of our mistakes. Ethan continued, his gaze steady, his tone unwavering. Whatever you've lost, whatever you've destroyed, it's not too late to be there for them. Fix yourself, Emily. For their sake, if not for me. He lingered for a moment, as if searching her face for any sign that she understood. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the echo of his final plea. A responsibility she could no longer ignore. As Ethan stepped out into the crisp night air, a strange mix of emotions settled over him. Relief, like a deep exhale after holding his breath for far too long, mingled with a dull, persistent ache in his chest. The decision to walk away felt final, but it wasn't without its weight. For years, he had loved Emily with everything he had. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the late nights spent talking about dreams that felt so vivid, so real. He could still picture her laughing at his clumsy attempts to dance in their tiny living room, or the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her art. Those memories, once a source of warmth, now felt distant, like watching someone else's life through a frosted window. He had tried to hold on to those moments, hoping they could be a foundation to rebuild on. But tonight had shown him the truth. That foundation had long since crumbled. His love for Emily wasn't enough to bridge the chasm she had created with her betrayal. And yet, there was no anger left in him, only sorrow. Sorrow for what they had lost. Sorrow for the future they had once dreamed of but would never share. But most of all, sorrow for their children, who would now grow up in a world where their family would never be the same. When Ethan reached his car, he paused, staring at his reflection in the window. He looked tired, more exhausted than he ever remembered feeling. But behind the weariness, there was a faint spark of resolve. His children deserved better. They deserved stability, love, and a father who wouldn't let the bitterness of the past define their future. Ethan exhaled slowly, straightening his posture. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to move forward. He would be there for his children, even if it meant carrying the emotional scars of betrayal alone. The love he had once poured into Emily would now be poured into them. He redirected that love to them, determined to ensure they felt secure and cherished, even in the absence of the life he had fought so hard to protect. As Ethan drove away, the sorrow that had gripped him so tightly began to loosen, replaced by a quiet, steady determination to rebuild. Not just for himself, but for his children. The house was silent, almost unbearably so. Emily sat in the living room, her fingers tracing the edge of a framed family photo on the coffee table. The picture captured a moment of joy frozen in time. Ethan smiling with his arm around her, their children laughing as they leaned into her side. It looked like a relic from another life, a life that now felt impossibly distant. She stared at the photo for what felt like hours, her thoughts spiraling through the choices that had led her here, the excuses she had whispered to herself, the justifications she had clung to, her desire for something new, the allure of Daniel's charm, which now felt hollow and selfish. She had been searching for freedom, excitement, a spark she believed had gone out. But in chasing those fleeting desires, she had lost everything that truly mattered. Ethan's words from the restaurant echoed in her mind. Fix yourself. For them, if not for me. His tone had been cold, final. But the truth behind it was undeniable. She had failed him. She had failed their marriage. And worst of all, she had failed their children. Her chest tightened as she thought of their innocent faces, still blissfully unaware of the storm that had torn through their family. The emptiness of the house seemed to press down on her, amplifying her guilt until it felt suffocating. She moved to the couch and sank into its worn cushions, clutching a pillow to her chest as if it could shield her from the weight of her emotions. Memories washed over her. The nights she and Ethan had stayed up late, planning their future. The laughter they had shared over small, silly things. She had traded all of that for an illusion, and now she was left with nothing but the aftermath. But beneath the crushing guilt, something stirred, a faint ember of resolve. She couldn't undo the past, but she couldn't remain paralyzed by it either. If she was going to rebuild anything, for herself, for her children, she needed to confront the person she had become and understand why she had fallen so far. The next morning, she took the first step. She picked up her phone and called a therapist. Her voice trembled as she explained her situation. I don't even know where to start, she admitted. I don't recognize myself anymore. Therapy became a space for reflection, a painful but necessary mirror held up to her choices. Through the sessions, Emily began to unearth the deeper truths she had buried beneath layers of avoidance. Her dissatisfaction with herself, her fear of aging, the misguided belief that excitement came from someone else rather than from within. She cried often during those early sessions. Tears of regret, sorrow, and the slow, fragile release of truths she could no longer run from. Those sessions were filled with tears, but each tear felt like a release, a step toward understanding and rebuilding. At home, Emily started small. She cleaned out the rooms she had avoided for weeks, the spaces still filled with Ethan's absence. She wrote letters she knew she might never send, apologizing to Ethan, to her children, and even to herself. And with every silent word, she made a promise, not out loud, but with conviction, that she would do better. She knew the path ahead would be long and lonely. The scars from her choices would remain, etched into her life like reminders. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. She was determined to turn those scars into lessons, a foundation on which to rebuild her life. This time it would be different. This time, she vowed to live with honesty, humility, and the unwavering love her children deserved. Daniel's life of deceit unraveled quickly after the confrontation at the restaurant. With Ethan's evidence in hand, and driven by a mix of anger and regret, Emily went to the authorities. She shared everything, the truth she had once tried to ignore. It didn't take long for Daniel's carefully spun web of lies to collapse. His trail of fraudulent activities, scams targeting vulnerable individuals under various aliases, caught up with him. A routine traffic stop led to his arrest when police discovered outstanding warrants linked to his past cons. The charm that had once disarmed his victims was useless in the face of damning evidence. In court, Daniel tried his usual defense, weaving elaborate tales of misunderstanding and painting himself as a victim of circumstance. But the evidence was overwhelming. Fake documents, suspicious bank transfers, and testimonies from multiple victims who had once trusted him. The judge's verdict was swift and unforgiving. Daniel was sentenced to years behind bars. As the prison doors slammed shut, he finally faced the consequences of his greed. His silver tongue, once so persuasive, was silenced by justice. Ethan's life, meanwhile, became a carefully constructed routine. Each day was meticulously planned, leaving little space for reflection. His mornings began with making breakfast for his children, two small faces lighting up the kitchen table with sleepy smiles as they chattered about their school projects and favorite cartoons. Ethan smiled, nodding along in encouragement, his heart warmed by their innocence yet heavy with the burden he silently carried. At work, he threw himself into his cases with relentless focus. His colleagues noticed his newfound intensity, often mistaking it for ambition. But for Ethan, it wasn't ambition. It was survival. Ethan's relentless focus at work became his shield, a way to drown out the memories of everything he had lost. He gave himself little room for personal thoughts, each victory in court serving as a fleeting balm for the pain he kept buried deep inside. Evenings, however, belonged to his children. He sat with them during homework time, read bedtime stories, and played board games. His laughter was real, even if his mind occasionally drifted. He often saw glimpses of Emily in them, the way their daughter scrunched her nose when she was concentrating, or how his son's laughter echoed hers. It was bittersweet, but Ethan refused to let his pain cloud his love for them. From his children's perspective, life felt different. They didn't fully understand why their father seemed quieter, more serious. He no longer hummed familiar tunes in the car or spoke about weekend plans with the same excitement. They noticed, too, that family dinners were just the three of them now, and their mother's absence was rarely mentioned. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, his youngest looked up with wide, innocent eyes. "Why doesn't Mommy eat with us anymore?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the quiet. Ethan hesitated, his fork pausing mid-air. "Mommy's busy right now," he said gently, his tone steady and calm. "But we'll see her soon." The children accepted his answer and returned to their plates. But Ethan could see the confusion lingering in their eyes. They sensed the shift, even if they didn't have the words to articulate it. That quiet, unspoken confusion weighed on him more than anything else. At night, when the house was still and the children were asleep, Ethan allowed himself brief moments of vulnerability. Sitting alone in the living room, he let his mind drift to the life he had lost, to the walls he had built around himself to keep the pain from seeping through. But those moments passed quickly. He had promises to keep, lives to nurture. There was no time to dwell on what could have been.